What's going on? My name is Philip. I had a lot of people ask me, some questions about aviation refinement, kind of how I got started, why I think it's a good business to get into, how you can get started as well. And so I kind of want to go over some points. I know I made a couple videos before kind of explaining, how I got started and what I like about it, but I'll try to put everything together in one video. So, kind of how I got started is right out of high school. I think in 2019 or 2020, I started working for somebody for 2 years doing it. And, with everything I ever do, I always take it seriously. So, I did my best at it. And, I ended up not necessarily running his company, but, I pretty much was doing everything because, everybody that I worked with kind of slacked off. So I was put in charge kind of everything. And, that's kind of how I learned, is just working for somebody else for 2 years, learning all the information, knowing what goes into everything that I need to do. And, I got really interested in flying, and so I wasn't making enough money to afford flight school. So, I asked my old boss for a raise, and he said no. And I told him I'll start cleaning smaller airplanes on the side, just to make up some extra money so I could learn how to fly. And he didn't like that idea, so he decided to fire me, and tried suing me for that. But I at that point, I had no other option other than to take aviation refinement, very seriously and do everything that I can to make my business successful. And with God's help, a lot of praying, a lot of hard work, I was able to become very successful in this field. And if you guys don't know what aviation refinement is, it's kind of comparable to car detailing. I already made a video about that, but it's on private aircraft. So, obviously a different skill set, different products, a different way to get clients. And I've seen God's hand in this business in my life, and I'm super, super grateful that this is the path that He has for me. And, for the first 2 years, like I said, since my old boss was, kind of running after me, trying to sue me, I had kind of lawyers after me a little bit. And, it was kind of slow just because of some legal notices he sent out to the companies in the area where I'm from, and I had a difficult time to get work. But, I still ended up getting my first client within, I want to say, 3 weeks of starting my business. Like, after forming the LLC, I got to it right away. I started, looking for clients, and I was able to land my first client, within the first 3 weeks. And, that kind of built into, a slow, but, kind of steady stream of income for the first 2 years. And, like I talked about in one of my other videos, I had to supplement for the first 2 years with a side hustle just because I wasn't making enough money. But, in 2023, I was super blessed. I got a contract to go out and do an airplane in California, which paid me like as much as some people make in a year. So that's kind of crazy to say, and it took me a month to do it. So, there's a lot of money to be made in this business. If you don't understand online business, this is a great business to get into. It's hands-on. It makes sense because it's physical work versus, sitting behind a keyboard and pressing buttons. So, I'm super, super grateful. I was able to buy a lot of really cool things. I was able to buy this McLaren. I was able to buy a Porsche. I was able to buy a house in one of the nicer neighborhoods in Colorado, and I'm super, super grateful. Another thing that I get asked a lot is, why I like this business so much. And, I think that I like it a lot because of the clients that I have. So the clients, they genuinely want to see you succeed, because obviously to own a private aircraft, you have to be pretty successful yourself. And, the people that you do work for, they genuinely cheer you on because they want to see you succeed. They love seeing young people get after it because, in today's generation, a lot of people, as soon as they wake up, they put their hand down their pants, they eat hot Cheetos and play video games all day. And, that's not the type of mindset that the successful people like to see. So, if they see a young guy, getting up, getting after it, chasing his dreams, trying to start a business, they're willing to support you for that. And, it genuinely excites them. And, through this business and through the connections that I made, I was able to, start other businesses as well. So, I have a business, something to do with cars. I do a little bit of real estate. I do a little bit of investing as well. But, my main focus in business is obviously this one, aviation refinement. But I'm just saying that through these connections with these successful and wealthy people, they do bring you opportunities. They do want to genuinely see you succeed. And, that's why I think it's a really good business to get into, and that's why I like doing it so much. Another thing is, a lot of people ask me, how could they get started? And really the way you could get started is, the same with anything. You have to learn all the information that goes into that type of business so you know exactly what you're doing. Because, number one, obviously getting clients for this type of business is extremely different than, any other business because, if you think about it, you probably don't know anybody with a private jet, and that's most of the population in the world as well. They don't know anybody with a private jet. So, there's a certain way to, get these clients. So you have to know how to get the clients. You have to know how to do the services. You have to know how to do the services properly. You have to know things about aviation, because, if you come up to an airplane, let's say you got your first client, but you don't know anything about aviation, you don't know anything about aircraft, and you think it's just as simple as wiping it down, that's a great way to damage, an aircraft and, cost yourself, $10-20 million because you didn't learn the proper information. So, obviously information is key if you want to get started, because, just like what I said, with any other business, whether you do trading, whether you do construction, or whether you want to do aviation refinement, you need to know the information before you get into something, just to protect yourself and, lower your risk of liability. Another thing that you need to know before you get started is obviously the products. So you can't really just use, let's say you get an airplane that you have to go out and do, you can't just use regular glass cleaner on it, because there's certain products that have to be used on an aircraft. You can't just go use whatever you want because it's cheaper. You have to know exactly what you're buying. You have to know what the products are used for. You have to know exactly the steps that you need to take, because on certain airplanes there's certain things that you can touch and you can't touch. There's certain things that have to be taped off. There's certain things that have to be looked out for, and there's certain things that have to be completed a certain way. So if you just kind of start and you don't really understand what you're doing, again, that's a really great way to make sure that you're in generational debt, because if you start touching 20 or 30 million dollar airplanes, it's going to be very, very hard to know what you're doing if you haven't had the proper training or the proper education. So that's a big key that I always tell people. If any business that you're interested to get into, whether again that's aviation refinement, construction, e-com, trading, whatever it is that you want to do, make sure you have the proper education, because spending money on education, or spending time on education, is definitely worth it. Because if you just decide to skip that step and you just decide to go hands-on, you're gonna have a very difficult time figuring out what you're doing. So save yourself the headache, save yourself the trouble, and save yourself some potential risk, and get the proper education. And if you guys want to learn more about aviation refinement, I provide more value on my Instagram. And if you guys are interested in getting into it, just send me a DM on Instagram and we could see if it's the right fit for you. I'll leave a link in the description so you guys could go check it out.